Wow, you honor me by coming today. Thank you. But I know it's because this topic's been in the news so much, and I think you kind of want to know about it a little bit. Um, um, I've been fortunate to be able to be funded by the National Science Foundation through the Center for Energy Smart Electronic Systems. This is a special program at the NSF. It's called the Industry University Cooperative Research Center Program, and the intent of the IUCRC program is to try to accelerate the transition of good ideas, good academic research ideas into practice, deployed actually into practice. This center was founded in 2011, and I have to say that it's been, in a sense, transformative in our ability to do our research because it's brought us so closely aligned with many, many, many companies. We probably have about 35 U.S. companies in the center now, including all the big ones that you are aware of that are building data centers. They're responsible for the problems that we're involved in here. So I gave a provocative title to the talk, Your AI Isn't Free, and it really isn't. There's a lot of things that aren't free, but the AI certainly isn't free. It does have a cost, and the cost is not only financial, the cost is in the environmental costs. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I primarily thought I would, first of all, I had a lot of fun making this talk because the National Science Foundation feels very strongly about the public dissemination of what we learn as researchers, that is, the dissemination of what we learn to the public. So I consider this just a wonderful opportunity of what the NSF means about taking what we learned and making it available and understandable by non-specialists. So that's my goal today. Before I forget, this is the next talk in the series. It's going to be in February by Tyler Mayfield from the Villanova School of Business. Please put it on your calendar and try to attend. So you wouldn't be here unless you've heard of data centers, and data centers have been all in the news. This is remarkable to me because I've been working in this field for almost 40 years, and I've been working with data centers for at least 30 years. But nobody ever heard of data centers until recently. That is, the public didn't really start talking about data centers until very, very recently. But believe me, they are not new. The largest data center that was first built, so-called hyperscale data center, was built by Facebook in Prineville, Oregon, about 2011. This is the beginning of what you would call the hyperscale data centers, the extremely, extremely large data centers, which are basically now what is in the public consciousness, right? But before the big hyperscale data centers, we had data centers everywhere. We called them computer rooms. Remember computer rooms? They were everywhere in all universities, in most institutions. And what's happening more and more in the current environment is the enterprise data centers that are operated by individual companies like Villanova University. We no longer want to operate our data centers. We want to give away our data center cooling and power and operations to third parties, companies that will operate the data centers for you. Those are called colos. And colos are everywhere, and is the biggest growing sector of the entire data center market. In addition to that, we have the companies that are running cloud services that we're all familiar with. You might think that the data centers are primarily these gigantic data centers here. This is in Fort Worth, Texas. It's operated by Meta. But actually, one of the most unique data centers I ever went to was in Manhattan, in a high-rise building, and it was operated by Morgan Stanley. Now, why would Morgan Stanley operate a data center? Well, obviously, they're very interested in doing very, very fast computations for financial transactions. In fact, the financial industry pushes the envelope of how rapidly you can compute because they talk about doing transactions in microseconds so that they can beat their competition in submitting a transaction. So actually, these data centers are very different, but they are in every sense of the word a data center. This kind of a data center is essentially the so-called hyperscale data center, the ones that are being operated by Meta and Google and Microsoft and Amazon and all the large companies that you're familiar with. So I'm sorry, I'm an engineer, so this looks like an engineering drawing, right? All right. I really need to say a few words about thermodynamics because this is what I teach and what I love. I'm a thermodynamicist by training and by my nature. So the first law of thermodynamics, it states that energy can be transformed, but it can't be destroyed. So the transforming part is really important. I wanted to point that out to you because it's really central to understanding what's happening in the data center industry. Okay, so this is a power plant, and the purpose of the power plant is to produce electrical grid power, right? The way it's done is by taking some initial fuel source, for example, a railroad car full of coal, and burning that coal in a large boiler. So we're getting an immediate transformation of energy from the chemical bond energy to heat. That's the first transformation. It heats up the water that's going through the boiler and it produces very high temperature pressure steam. So now we have flow energy, another transformation. That flow energy goes through a very large turbine. Basically, it spins this mechanical turbine. We see another transformation from the flow energy to mechanical energy of rotation, moving metal, rotating metal. That's all it is. That rotating metal turns a electrical generator, and it transforms the shaft power. This is the most miraculous transformation from what I sort of feel. This miraculous transformation of mechanical rotation of a shaft into electrons, which is a miraculous thing. I don't get tired of ever telling that to my students, saying, how does that happen? But in addition to that, though, you got to get rid of the flow. You have to condense it back into its liquid state. And the way you do it is by rejecting heat, taking heat out of it. And you take the heat out of it by putting it through a cooling tower. And that cooling tower rejects that waste heat into the atmosphere. So this is a very good example of what's called a Rankine cycle power plant, which is a typical power plant used not only in fossil fuel applications, but also Limerick out here in our area. Instead of using coal, it uses essentially nuclear power, nuclear energy in order to produce the heat. But heat is really important to this entire process. Okay, so it's really important. I thought it was very important that we get this idea that we can transform that energy, but we can't get rid of it. All right. So look at what happens here. So draw the big box around this power station, and forget about what's inside. What do we see? We see energy coming in. We see energy coming out as the electrical power, and we see heat coming out of this thing. So the energy that gets put into this power plant essentially either gets transformed into what we want, the electrical power, or it gets rejected as heat. And so here's the first bit of sustainability that I'd like to discuss, this idea of energy sustainability. That is, the energy sustainability is measured by how effectively did we use that natural resource. And the way we usually talk about it in power engineering is by dividing what we wanted, the electrical power, by what we put in, which was the energy that we put in. And that ratio is called the energy conversion efficiency. So, for example, fossil power plants have an energy conversion efficiency from about 30 to 50%. Nuclear power plants, large ones, about 33%. Remarkably, hydroelectric power plants have about a 90% conversion efficiency. Boy, I wish we could use hydroelectric power for everything, but obviously it's highly restricted to only a few areas where you get sufficient hydrostatic head in order to operate. Okay? You get it? That's your lesson in thermodynamics. Energy can be transformed, but it can't be destroyed. So here's my conundrum. This is the data center. Right? So the data center is nothing more than a large building with electronic devices, servers that are doing computational transactions here. Okay? It's like a gigantic toaster oven. This is the conundrum of data centers. Here's my grid power that I'm putting into the data center at 480 volts AC. It's going into, I'll show you where it goes in a moment, okay? But just draw the big dotted line to begin with. You take this electrical power that's going in, and then ask yourself, where does it go? Where does the electrical power go? Okay? Well, first of all, what we want is the stream of phonons going through a fiber optic cable out of the data center. Believe it or not, from a physical point of view, what we call the information that we're getting from the data center is a stream of phonons that are streaming out of the data center in fiber optic cables. Okay. The problem is, the energy problem and the sustainability problem is, it has almost no energy, really. It's got a lot of value, it's got a lot of content, but it has almost no energy. So, of the total amount of electrical power that we put into the data center, about 98% of it gets transformed into heat. And that's why we have gigantic toaster oven, the data center. Okay? That's a real conundrum. I thought about this problem for a very long time. The reason I thought about this problem is because, going back to my previous example, I'm used to being able to talk about the conversion of energy into something useful. But here, the energy that we're putting in is not being converted into an energy form. It's being converted into some kind of information stream, but it has no energy content. The bottom line, I can't define the sustainability metric in terms of energy. The sustainability metric cannot be written in terms of energy. And if I did, I would find that the efficiency is about zero. It has zero thermodynamic efficiency, so something's clearly wrong with this picture here. Okay, and I'm not just being coy here, although I am a little bit, to be provocative. Okay? There's something wrong with this picture, but we can't change it. There is one thing that there are a lot of things we can change, but we're not going to change this. And the reason we're not going to change this is because the integrated circuit was invented around 1950, right? And it changed the world. Right? The integrated circuit, that is the ability to put an electronic circuit on silicon and being able to put it in the laptop and everything else in our lives, including our phones and so forth. It transformed everything. And we immediately jumped onto the bandwagon of accepting the integrated circuit as a fantastically life-transforming technology. And what we didn't realize, it was going to take us down this path where the ability to use an integrated circuit takes a very large of electrical power. What it really requires is electrical voltage. And that electrical voltage essentially is used to close the gates in that circuit. But the bottom line is, most of the current that's generated for that power is dissipated as heat. We're not going to do anything about this because there's no technology on the horizon that's going to replace the silicon-based integrated circuit as the basis for all of our modern life, all of our modern computations, all of our communications, all of our entertainment, and so forth and so on. So what can we do about it? We're not going to change the basic problem. I wish we could, but we're too far into it to change it. So why are we paying attention? I mean, why are you here today? Because of this, largely here. So the reason that we're suddenly very aware of what's going on in the data center industry is because NVIDIA has quietly been working on graphic processing units, GPUs, for a really long time, and only gamers used to hear about NVIDIA because gamers all knew that they made the best graphics cards. Right? So there's probably people in this room who still use an NVIDIA graphics card. Right? And that's how they plugged along as a modestly successful company for many, many years. And I claim they were lucky. And I asked a recent Villanova graduate who was employee number 6 at NVIDIA, who came to visit us. I said, "You got lucky, didn't you? You just totally got lucky, didn't you? Because it was found that the graphic processing unit architecture is far, far more efficient in doing AI computations than Intel's CPU." And they immediately took over the market. And I think they got lucky. They say they didn't, but you have to have had this legacy of knowing how to design this architecture, and suddenly you have the killer app. Suddenly AI is there for you to be able to take advantage of your architecture. So what happened is then the CPU, this is the version called the NVIDIA Blackwell chip, which was introduced last year. This is a GPU, graphic processing unit, and that is being used now for the kinds of servers that are used for artificial intelligence, right? So this is right out of the NVIDIA website. There's been a 1,000x increase in the computational power in just 8 years. 1,000x, right? That's 1 times 10 to the third. And so the ability to compute is just going exponentially high. And every time we increase the circuit, that is the GPU, in order to be able to do more computation, we also require more power, and therefore we also release more heat from these devices. Okay, so this is about 1,000 to 4,000 watts for one of these GPUs here. This is from our partners at NVIDIA. This is the thermal design point for one of these large silicon-based CPUs. And the thermal design point basically is how many watts does it dissipate? 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. We're about here right now, about 1,500 watts as a function of years here. So we were muddling along for many, many years, cooling things with air, you know, all the way up through to the 2010s, and all of a sudden this curve took off. And of course, NVIDIA, this is from one of their charts, NVIDIA will not share their actual roadmap, their actual data. The actual data is behind this yellow curve. But one thing we know for sure is this power dissipation from these kinds of devices has just gone through the roof and will continue going through the roof. There's some public information which we can glean kind of what's happening in the industry. This is a really pretty good report. It's written by Deloitte. Basically, it says something that's very important to remember. And what they point out is even though it seems like the power for data centers is getting extraordinarily high, actually, it only will make up about 2% of the total global electricity consumption in 2025. Only about 2%, okay? So the rest of it is used by industry. It's used for keeping the library, you know, habitable. It's used for electric vehicles increasingly and so forth. So let's not get too excited. It's only 2% of the total power globally. Okay? What's been in the news recently is that the total amount of power that's being consumed by the data center industry itself in the U.S. is going to double from 2023 to 2030. In just the next 7 or 8 years, the amount of power being absorbed or consumed by data centers is going to go very high, that it's going to double. And that's been in the news because it catches everybody by surprise, including the power suppliers, the utilities that provide electrical power. We were in a meeting last week with the WISE Forum in the College of Engineering, and their representatives from some of the local utilities who are really expressing quite a bit of anxiety about the sort of strategic planning that's needed in order to be able to keep up with this power demand. Right? So this chart here from 2022 to 2030 shows that the data center power consumption will double in 2030. But again, right now we're at about 2% global. It'll rise to about 4% global in 2030. So it's increasing. It's definitely increasing. But it's not 50%. It's not even 10%. It's only about 4% of global power consumption. Okay. This is from a McKinsey report. Sorry you didn't copy very well. I apologize for that. In the McKinsey report, they claim that the share of the total U.S. power demand is going to be up to about 12% in 2030. So they're a little bit more not optimistic, but they're predicting a higher increase in total power from the industry. Let me pause here for a second and sort of reflect on this. I think what takes reflection is even though the total amount of power that's being consumed by the industry doesn't seem to be high, it's a very, very important part of our daily lives, right? We will not be able to not have our social media. We will not expect to have instant service on our iPhones. We will increasingly be moving towards continual use of everything the data centers provide. So we're going to expect it to be there 24/7 instantly. So we, I think, need to reflect on the fact that it isn't free. the power that's being consumed in order to get these services is going to continue to increase. What we want to do is be able to get it sustainably, and I think that's what we should pay attention to. I want to point out then on that topic, then just a quick story, keep track of our time here. The data center industry from about 2011 was consuming a tremendous amount of power for cooling. The reason they were using a lot of power for cooling is because they were cooling using refrigeration like a refrigerated air conditioner. Okay. About 2011, Facebook built a funny data center in Oregon. They called it the chicken coop. The reason they called it the chicken coop, it was air cooled, and they replaced the refrigeration cooling with evaporative cooling, so-called adiabatic cooling. I don't know if any of you are from the Southwest. I grew up in Texas. In hot, dry climates, you can use evaporative cooling, meaning you can pass air through media. You keep the media wet, and you pass the air through that media, and basically it cools the air by the evaporation of water into the media. That's called evaporative cooling. It doesn't work very well in humid climates because you can't get that transport of water into vapor and therefore absorbing the heat. Well, what happened is Meta, Facebook at the time, discovered they could save a tremendous amount of energy and cost by switching over to evaporative cooling, and basically they transformed the industry because the industry quickly caught on to the idea. The problem is they replaced electrical power with water. So here's a plot or a representation from a famous report that was issued in 2016 that showed that in fact for data centers, the amount of water being consumed by the data centers continued to increase, right? There's one other thing I want to point out to you, which is important from a sustainability point of view. The on-site water consumption at the data center site is in itself not the major part of the water consumption. The largest part of the water consumption is, in fact, where you're generating the electricity at your power plant. And that's a very important thing to remember that I'd like for you to keep in mind as we talk about a couple of other topics. The on-site consumption of water is actually relatively low. It's the power plant where you're using the power. And in fact, I think I can tell you immediately that that's where you need to hit the problem. It's not at the data center entirely, but at the generation of power. Okay. So here is an important plot for me and what we do in my laboratory here at Villanova. This is a graph that shows the percentage of the power in the data center that goes into computing. About 40% goes into the actual computing, the number crunching. About 20% goes into the cooling system. So you use as much power for cooling these hot chips as you use in actually doing the computation itself. And that's about 80% of the total power you put in. You also have to turn on lights and run network equipment and so forth. And so I will say kind of cynically, this keeps me happy because I'm a thermal person, and the thermal cooling is a very, very important part of operating a modern data center. So here's the punchline from the previous graph I showed you about water consumption. This is a companion plot from the 2016 Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory report, a very influential report. By the way, the Department of Energy has commissioned a follow-on report, which is scheduled to be released in 2024. Okay. These guys, and I think the lead investigator is this guy, Cooney. This is the annual electricity use in billions of kilowatt hours per year versus year. This is the increase as a result of internet, basically, up to about here, and then it kind of leveled off, right? It kind of leveled off, and they predicted that if we would have continued on the path that we were on in 2010, we would have gone in this direction here. And a lot of that was due to the cooling. A lot of that was due to using refrigeration in cooling the data center. But when they shifted over to evaporative cooling, what happened is it kind of leveled off because we were able to greatly drop the amount of power that was being used for the cooling. Okay, so this is about where we were. Okay, but this goes to show you how hard, how difficult it is to have a crystal ball that you actually believe in, right? Who could have expected? Who could have expected in 2024 this curve, in fact, was going to be that curve? In fact, it was going to take off along that trajectory there, which is exactly what has happened, right? And so, yes, we bought some time. We were able to cool with air very efficiently using adiabatic cooling. Yes, we're using more water, but in fact, it's a more sustainable data center. It was definitely in the right direction from the point of view of sustainability, right? So we now find ourselves falling off a cliff over here because we suddenly find ourselves that the amount of power being used is now, of course, going extremely high, and it affects both how we generate the power and how we cool the chips. So those are the two big pieces of this puzzle here. Okay, so where can we attack the problem from a sustainability point of view? Okay, how can we decarbonize the data center industry? Well, we can work on the front end. We can work on the front end by replacing fossil fuel electrical power to the data center with renewable solar and onshore and even offshore wind, of course. That goes without saying, right? I actually won't say very much about that because that one is obvious. If we can make a transition from to renewable energy, we can hit the problem here and we can supply essentially, if you will, green energy to the data center, and this is where you're going to have the greatest impact. One of the things I know that you've heard recently is the discussion about dropping nuclear into the mix, the possibility of using nuclear energy on the front end here. And on the front end here, that's why I highlighted in red. I will say a few words about that because it's an interesting development. In the middle, we can look at operations. We can have more efficient processors. Believe me that NVIDIA and AMD and all the other processor companies are definitely working on more efficient processors. In fact, the efficiency of the processors has greatly increased over the last 10 years. Efficient computing, meaning the algorithms that are used in doing the computation, there is a thing called sustainable computing. There are people here at Villanova that are thinking about sustainable computing. And the third is an area that we work on with more efficient cooling, higher capacity, more efficient cooling. So that's how you can attack the problem inside the data center. And then at the back end, I think something that might be obvious to you is, can we use all this waste heat? Can't we use this 98% of the total power? Can't we capture this waste heat and do something with it? I'll say a few words about that. What I'll primarily, unfortunately, have to say, it's really difficult. And I'll show you the reasons why it's very difficult to attack the problem right here. So this is from a report from Schneider Electric. They write some really excellent white papers on the topics. I understand that it's good advertising for them, but they're really smart. And they really do write some really excellent white papers. So here's a white paper that Schneider published on sustainability metrics for data centers, right? And I enjoyed reading this because it basically talked about what, we typically talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions when we talk about engineering systems like this, okay? The bottom line is, so we don't have to spend a lot of time here. Obviously, data centers, like all other industries, produce greenhouse gases. And we'd like to try to eliminate, the greenhouse gases emitted by the data center. 50% of those gas emissions from the data centers are from scope 2. That is where you're generating the power. You're not generating the power at the data center, you're generating the power at the power station, power generation. 50% of the power is from indirect emissions. Indirect emissions actually are related to things like waste management, business travel, minor operations within data centers, surprising things that really have very little to do with the operation of the data center. The direct emissions from the data center are actually very small. It doesn't have a smokestack. You're not getting any direct CO2 emissions from the data center. So again, it kind of points out the big opportunity. The big opportunity is knocking down the use of fossil fuel in the power generation on the front end here. This is one of the conclusions that you might draw from the study from Schneider. Okay? So let's look at that front end in particular. I just wanted to comment a little bit about this big buzz that we've heard about recently. Like this story hit around November, right? So in November, everybody got really surprised because Microsoft announced that they were going to purchase energy from 3 Mile Island Unit 1 for the next 20 years. Microsoft didn't purchase Unit 1. Microsoft is in no way an owner or an operator of 3 Mile Island, but they agreed that they would purchase the power from the at the time it was a functioning but non-used unit in TMI. Unit 2 is the one that encountered problems, and that's shut down forever. But Unit 1 was functional. It was basically decommissioned because of cost and other things like that. So we suddenly hear that Microsoft feels that the amount of power that is available to them based on their growth as a result of the AI explosion is not sufficient for them to keep up with the demand. And so as part of their commitment for sustainable non-fossil fuel energy, they agreed to try using nuclear. Well, they set off a so-called firestorm because in the industry, there's probably a dozen different negotiations that are currently in the works from data center operators, data center companies, in order to be able to either do the same thing as Microsoft or simply purchase the power from existing nuclear stations. I guess the thing that I think is it will be a incentive to think hard about whether the nuclear energy is going to be part of the future non-fossil mix. My own opinion is I think it will, because kind of quietly over the last 30 years, there's been a lot of activity on these things. These things are called small modular reactors, SMRs. And SMRs have been under development and under research for a very long time, especially at some of the national laboratories. This picture is from Idaho National Labs in Idaho. Right? So what is an SMR? An SMR is just a small nuclear reactor. The concept would be that you could take that nuclear reactor, you could put it, it's about the size of a shipping container or even smaller. You could put that on a truck and you can ship that small nuclear reactor to your site and install it in your site as a power source. Okay, so essentially they are fission reactors, just like we're used to. They're about a quarter or even smaller the size of a regular reactor, and it's possible to assemble them off-site and then ship them on-site. Okay, so I know that not everybody, maybe a lot of people in this room, are not big fans of nuclear reactors, right? What's the biggest problem with nuclear reactors? The biggest problem is what do you do with a spent fuel? It's always been the problem with nuclear energy is what do you do with spent fuel? You all have heard some of the outlandish things, right? We could probably do it now. Yeah, put it on a SpaceX rocket, shoot it into space, right? Literally, there's been discussion about that. Or the non-sustainable thing, which is put it in 55-gallon drums and ship it to the state of Washington, right? Which is what they did for many, many years, right? Or go to Nevada and bury it in a salt dome deep underground, bury that waste deep underground in underground salt caverns, which are available in Nevada. So it's not a panacea. It's certainly not going to replace solar and wind, but I think it needs to be taken seriously because of its versatility. So some of the experts that I've talked with that think that this might be real also point out some problems. One of the problems is data center loads are constantly varying. That is, the demand for power is constantly varying. And nuclear reactors aren't great at changing the amount of power they're delivering. They want to deliver a steady source of power. What does that mean? That means you're going to have to develop energy storage, massive energy storage capability in order to operate this data center using nuclear power. But some of the competing things that I won't talk about are fuel cells, for hydrogen sources. But I still think that the mix is going to have to involve all of them, including the small modular reactors. I thought I would mention it to you in case you didn't hear about SMRs. It is something that hasn't gotten a lot of national attention, but I predict you're going to start hearing about SMRs as a result of this new attention of using nuclear in power plants. All right, so let me kind of close out here. Because of this really large increase in power, in my world, it's kind of shifted us from being able to use air for cooling data centers to using water, single-phase cooling, and then eventually, when this runs out of capacity, moving to two-phase cooling. Two-phase cooling is cooling where you use refrigerants instead of water, and you allow the refrigerant to boil or change phase from liquid to vapor, and by that transformation, this is how you absorb the heat. So where are we today? Today we are right here. We're in single-phase cooling. I've waited 35 years watching this industry talk about water cooling in electronics, and suddenly, 3 years ago, it happened. It just happened. I've been waiting for it because, I've attended conferences in this field for all of my career, and they're always talking about liquid cooling. And all of a sudden, about 3 years ago, it just said, yeah, we have to. Why is it? Because of the AI. Because the AI, basically, the power being generated could no longer be handled by air, and so we had to naturally make the move to liquid cooling. I showed this lonely rack here because it's an example of what immediately transforms the industry. If you would have been smart and you're a smart investor, you would have been paying attention to super micro, right? Like a lot of big investors were paying attention to super micro, a Taiwanese company that does a lot of business in the US. The reason is because they had established a strategic partnership with NVIDIA. And the partnership was, we will build the servers and we will package them in racks for your chips, for your GPUs. So this is an example of a supermicro water-cooled cabinet where all of these individual servers essentially are high power, high performance NVIDIA GPU servers. Right? The amount of power that they dissipate is phenomenal. We used to talk about 20 kilowatts in a rack like this as being a hot rack when we were cooling with air. Now we're talking about 200 kilowatt racks in my lab at Villanova, testing a 200 kilowatt rack. That's a toaster oven, a humongous toaster, right? It couldn't possibly be cooled with air. It has to be cooled with liquid. Okay, so this is what's in our lab in the new Drozdik building in the basement. So this is that rack I just showed you. It's called an NVIDIA NV72 rack. You place servers in each one of these shelves, and we just received these. We will be receiving the servers soon. But we're not going to be receiving actual NVIDIA servers because they're way too expensive. What we, in fact, will be doing is doing experimental testing with surrogates called thermal test vehicles. So these thermal test vehicles essentially look like the servers. They have 8 GPU-like heaters to represent the GPUs, and then some other smaller components here. So this might represent the GPUs in an actual server, and we're using this as a surrogate to try out cooling systems. So here's an example of a cooling system that mounts onto the server. I've shown this to a lot of people who've come to my lab, and they stare at it and they said, oh, I can't believe this. You have a silicon device underneath these cold plates that are touching the chip. And on top of that, you have all of this copper. How is that? How is it you're crushing, fantastically delicate silicon chips with a massive mechanical cooling system? Right now, we don't have any other way to do it. So you might ask yourself, well, why are we using copper? Because we're using refrigerants. And for refrigerants to operate properly, they have to operate at elevated pressures. And so to operate at elevated pressures, we have to contain that pressure using solid materials rather than rubber hose or other kinds of compliant materials. This entire system is designed to allow you to cool one of these by placing what's called a cold plate on top of the GPU and then circulating fluid through the channels in that CPU, and by that method picking up the heat and removing the heat out of the server. You see these hoses here? Although this is for a single-phase system, a two-phase system would be similar. These gigantic hoses are what's bringing in the fluid into the cabinet and then taking the fluid out of the cabinet. Right? So at the heart, at the lowest scale, is this cold plate, which is designed to absorb the heat from one single CPU. Okay. So where's the research here? So the research, and a lot of my research team is sitting right there. So this is their work. So what we're working on is how do we use low global warming potential refrigerants that will not essentially contribute to global warming. How do we use those for high processor cooling? Okay. So what you're looking at here is the flow through these small channels. They're called microchannels. They're very, very small. They're being heated from below, and what happens as the flow comes through, it starts to change phase from liquid to vapor, thanks to Shaw, my postdoc, for taking these beautiful images with a really high-speed camera. If you zoom in, you can see the formation of these individual vapor bubbles that are essentially what are absorbing the heat from this system and then transporting it out of the cold plate. Sorry. Okay. So that's one of the things we're working on. The real engineering challenge is how do we work on low global warming potential fluids that still do well enough as a heat transfer fluid, that still can remove the heat, because they're contrary to each other. If you get low global warming refrigerants, generally speaking, they will not be as good at removing heat as some of the standard refrigerants. Okay. I show you this picture, which is direct immersion cooling. In particular, I want to show you one that's being used in Bitcoin mining. Okay, so here I want to show you. This is what's called a miner. That miner is one of hundreds that are put into these tanks, and then the tanks are full of this fluid. I think I can play this. These miners are actually immersed in that fluid. Okay, we hate Bitcoin miners, right?
Yes.
We hate them because it's a non-sustainable enterprise. The amount of electrical power required to Bitcoin mine is obscene. That is the correct word. It's obscene, right? I will say there is one good thing. I hate them as much as you do because it's just a non-sustainable enterprise from an energy point of view. However, there is one thing that I do have to thank the Bitcoin industry about. They're mostly a bunch of cowboys, renegades. They don't want to follow the rules. They don't want to be regulated. However, they did do something that was helpful to the data center industry. They ventured into a place where no conventional data center has ventured, which is trying out large-scale immersion cooling, where you take the electronics, you put them directly into this mineral oil, this synthetic oil, and just cool them by dropping the electronics into the oil itself. That's called immersion. Okay? So even though they're not sustainable, they have taught mainstream companies that it's feasible to use immersion cooling on a large data center scale. And it does work. It has many problems, of course, associated with it. One of the big problems associated with the use of mineral oil in electronics is the compatibility between the materials of the electronics and the fluid itself. I want to stop and say one thing about sustainability. Why is this a good idea? A, it's a very good way to cool. B, this is the sustainability part that's very useful. You can recover the heat at really high temperatures, much higher than you could recover them as with air, and that's good. Okay, so that's good for this last project that I'll mention to you. This is called waste heat recovery. Okay, so here we're working with NVIDIA on this very large project. We're looking at 4 different scenarios by which you can reuse waste heat. And one of the things that you can do with waste heat is you can generate electricity, or you can generate cooling. So I won't go into these awful details of these engineering charts, but that's kind of interesting. You can take that waste heat and you can produce electricity. You can see the obvious benefit of that. Or you can use heat to produce cooling. You can see how you can put that cooling back in the data center. So waste heat is uncharted territory, and it's a very important area in the back end of trying to increase sustainability. The problem using data center waste heat, it's at pretty low temperatures. And one thing we know about recovering waste heat using any method that you can think of, the higher is the temperature, the more efficiently you'll be able to make use of that waste heat. And the energy, the heat that comes out of data center cooling systems, is probably going to be about 60 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Celsius at the most. The problem with this, for example, this system here, which generates electricity, is its conversion efficiency is going to be about 6%. 6%. And that's the problem with recovering waste heat. So we could do what the Europeans are doing. Put your data centers next to a city where you can make use of the waste heat and put it into a building. That's obviously the low-hanging fruit. The problem in the U.S. is that U.S. operators do not want to be in urban environments. The U.S. has lots of land. Europe does not. It's obvious that urban data centers would be more common in Europe and places like that. But in the U.S., U.S. operators do not want to be co-located with buildings that could make use of the waste heat. Okay? So that is the end of the story. I just wanted to also mention we've just launched into a very large project that's funded by the Department of Energy, the ARPA-E program. It's called the Cooler Chips program. We are part of a large team headed by NVIDIA. Ortega is the big cooling company. Ovid makes specialty cooling, and our partners at Binghamton University. We are going to be building a demonstration of a very advanced cooling system, highly sustainable cooling system. In order to make a few minutes for questions, if you want to see this video, I won't show it right now, but it does demonstrate one last thing that I wanted to say. One of the biggest uses of GPUs is not just in computing for ChatGPT and whatever. One of the largest growing enterprises in computation for high-performance computing is what are called digital twins, meaning that before you build any kind of a system, whether it's for an engineering system or a biological system or a robotics system, you first create it digitally. And so this is one of the largest growing areas in the entire engineering enterprise, is building accurate, physics-rich digital twins that essentially will duplicate everything about the design that you're building before you ever build it. Okay? So this video actually shows a digital twin of the system that this team is building. And at Villanova, we will be doing a lot of the experimental and modeling work for the heart of the system, which is going to be a system that cools not only using the cold plate, but also using the immersion cooling in a different way. So I want to thank you, and I want to make time for some questions. Thanks for your attention. I'm really honored.
Thanks. I think we have time for questions, and if people want to just raise their voices, I think we should be able to hear.
I'll ask. So you talked about a lot about the power use and the water use. Can you speak a little bit about like the fact, like I guess the water use is more sustainable, but then there are issues in like desert climates where they're making these things, and then the water use is being redirected to data centers. Do you have?
So the use of water for evaporative cooling, to my mind, was always a little bit problematic. We are fairly quickly moving away from that era anyway, because we can't cool data centers with air anymore. And that was really important when we still could. I would say that actually a large portion of data centers still can be cooled with air. What I find problematic is siting these data centers in regions that don't have a lot of water. Right. The first time I really got mad as a Southwesterner, I grew up in West Texas, is when Facebook decided to build a data center in Los Lunas, New Mexico, which is southern New Mexico, kind of mid New Mexico. I looked at that news story and said, "Are you kidding me? There's no water there." And whatever water there is should be used for farming and production of food. Instead, they're going to be competing for those water rights, which is what they convinced the city government and the state government of doing, right? Well, there's plenty of water for everybody. There isn't. So I find it really problematic using water for evaporative cooling when you don't have any water. Okay. I would say that era is diminishing because it will be a time when we can no longer use air for the majority of cooling anyway. But we've gone through about the last 20 years where this is what we have. That's a dirty little secret. Please.
You talked about using low GWP.
Yes.
Is that because of fear of leaks or?
Yeah, because leaks for sure, but you also have to worry about the eventual destination refrigerants. So, there are two major American refrigerant manufacturers. Both of them are in our centers, Honeywell and Chemours. Chemours is the offshoot of DuPont here in Delaware, right? This is what they say. We design a system assuming that 100% of the refrigerant being used in that system will eventually be liberated into the atmosphere. This is what they told me. This is what they responded. This is what the U.S. government requires that we take into account. Right? And the reason for that is because you need to ask yourself, well, what is the destination for used refrigerant eventually, right? It's very difficult. Just like spent fuel in nuclear reactors, eliminating refrigerants is actually equally problematic. But that's basically how they do the calculations, assuming all of it's going to be liberated into the air. One of the really nice things about refrigerants is when it does leak, it doesn't leak as a liquid. It evaporates into a vapor. So you don't have any imminent danger of that refrigerant being a contaminant or being a health hazard. So that's one of the things that people like about using refrigerants. And so that the goal for low GWP refrigerants is when they do escape, they will not increase global warming. That basically is the bottom line. Okay. Did I say anything about PFAS? I didn't. And so they don't want to say anything about PFAS either. PFAS are the forever chemicals, right? The problem is, yes, we can get low GWP refrigerants, but they're still PFAS-based refrigerants, right? And so I didn't mention that because that's really not a sustainability problem. It's an environmental hazard kind of problem. It most certainly is related to from the point of view of it being environmentally hazardous. That's a huge problem for every industry, not just the data center industry. Please.
You have a waste heat.
We do.
One of the things that needs heat is direct air capture, carbon dioxide.
Yes.
Could we pair the data center with that plant?
We are working on a project that Aaron Wemoff, one of our researchers, is working with Microsoft on that very project, using waste heat as a precursor to a chemical process for carbon sequestration. It's a project that was initiated by Microsoft. Yeah. So it is definitely. So to this point, personally, my own belief, and I've said this publicly in many places, I do not think a mechanical path is a way to use low temperature waste heat. It just will not work. We'll never make it efficient enough. But the way to use waste heat efficiently is through some thermochemical path, right? Using chemistry in order to be able to grab that low temperature waste heat, be able to use it to produce some chemical reaction more efficiently that would then reduce the energy load for that chemical reaction. That's right on, exactly what you said. There could be many, many others. Start a company, figure out a process that needs low-grade waste heat. Agnes, I think you had a question.
Yeah, just curiosity. Thank you for your talk. I learned a lot. The synthetic oil that they use now in the immersion cooling,
Yes.
the Bitcoin industry, what happens to it? Is it reused, the oil? Does it produce waste as well?
So first of all, I bet the Bitcoin industry never asked themselves this question.
Sure.
It is like mineral oil. Actually, one of the oils that they use is kind of an organic oil, so it's not really that insidious. It's not that dangerous. I don't actually know the answer to your question about how they dispose of the mineral oil? That's a very good question, though, and I'm sorry I really don't know the answer to that. But I do know that it is not as environmentally a concern as the PFAS-based refrigerants, for example. Yes, Joseph?
I'd first like to thank you and thank everybody for being here. This is part of a series of talks that go across disciplines. And this was, thank you for your presentation where we have, you've explained thermodynamics to people in the English department and people beyond. I wanted to ask, you said there was a 6%, I didn't quite catch it, for the waste heat.
Yeah.
A 6% loss?
No, 6% conversion efficiency.
Could you explain what that means?
Sure. So of the waste heat that you put in, and it's 98% of the power you put in,
Right.
right? So you're talking about megawatts of power. 98% of it is heat. If you then create this organic rankine cycle engine that takes this low grade, it's called low grade waste heat, as opposed to, for example, automotive waste heat, which is high temperature. Take this low grade waste heat, you put it into this machine, you will only be able to convert about 6% of it into electricity. So that's called the conversion, the energy conversion efficiency, and it's extremely low for these kind of mechanical engines that produce heat. Nevertheless, NVIDIA really wants to try and demonstrate it, right? I personally think that is not the path. That is not the path to go to. The only paths that make sense to me are regulation and legislation to force data centers to make use of their waste heat by co-locating with industries that can take advantage of the waste heat, right? So right now there is no regulation. They are not forced to do anything with it. And in my view, that's the only thing that's going to change this is to force them. It's not a new thing.